All right, everyone, it's just after 4 o'clock and we're gonna get started. So welcome to our 4 o'clock session. Thank you all for hanging in there. Got this session and a session after that, so we're almost done for the day. My name is Jim Ostrowski. I'm with the Environmental Support Division of Eagle. I welcome you the session on water equity. So I'm gonna turn it over to Regina in just a moment, but for those of you who have not been on a webinar yet in this conference, I just wanna go over our housekeeping. Most of you know the deal, but all lines are muted during the webinar. We are recording this session and we'll post it on the event website as soon as we can. So you'll soon see that if probably by tomorrow morning. If you have a question, you can type it into the question box, the Q&A box in your Zoom toolbar, or you can use the Whova app if you're using that, and I know many of you are. You can type your question in there or your chat message, whatever you want, and we will see it there as well. So those are the housekeeping guidelines. I'll turn it over to Regina.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon, everyone. This is our water equity session. We've got water experts, affordability experts, advocates, and our goal here is to talk about how we get there. We know it's a journey. We know we're not there yet. And it's an important conversation that is a big part of our work from the environmental justice standpoint. So I'm going to intro the folks you'll be hearing from today, and then I'll go through and ask them questions. As Jim may have mentioned, you can use the Q&A section to ask questions along the way. But I want to start by introing Nina Sassy. So Nina is formerly the Clean Water Public Advocate and just recently took on the role of Executive Director of the Michigan Infrastructure Council. So how are you, Nina? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Regina. Thanks for having me on this session.
Thanks, and we're also joined by Oday Salim. He is the attorney for the National Wildlife Federation. Good afternoon, Oday.
Good afternoon, all.
And Sylvia Ordono is with us. Hopefully I did that right. I always mess it up.
Orduno.
Orduno.
I keep helping you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you. Who is both a member of the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice and the co-chair of the National Advisory on Environmental Justice for the EPA. Thank you, Sylvia, for joining us.
Thank
you. Got the call to wear black and white. We're matching.
I did. Thanks.
And Monica Lewis Patrick. She is with We the People, the co-founder and president and CEO, a member of the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice, or the MACUJ, and a water advocate. Good afternoon, Monica. You're on mute.
Good to be with you all.
Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I know it's an important one. So I'm going to start out with Nina. We were just having our conversation about, are we going to do interviews? Are we going to do slides? And I know as part of Nina's conversation, she's going to talk a lot about the work that has gone before, some of the efforts that will continue, even though she won't be in that water position, but still focused on infrastructure. So Nina, do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the things that have happened on the water side from the advocate standpoint?
Yes, definitely. And I was mentioning to Regina as I was preparing for this presentation, I'm a very visual person. So I have this PowerPoint together that helped me really digest water equity because it is this big concept with a lot of moving parts. So let me load my presentation. I hope this is helpful for other people out there that enjoy their visual aids. Let's see here.
We don't see them yet.
All right, yeah, I'm not having a lot of luck with seeing it pop up, so I may just have to talk you through it. I'm going to try it one more time. Okay, there we are. All right, so when I was thinking of just water equity, I thought about my role as Clean Water Public Advocate, and it's very interesting because I got to hear from community residents that were experiencing water quality issues access issues, but also community water suppliers that were dealing with diminished capacity when it came to staffing, supporting their infrastructure needs. And then also in this role, I was involved in those policy conversations as we talk about funding and how do we make sure that funding goes to the right communities at the right time so that they can be sustainable. How do we fill that equity gap? So to me, there's a lot of moving pieces. There's this overarching water equity, which is essentially how do we ensure that Michigan residents have access to affordable, clean water? But what are the many moving pieces to that and how can we be impactful? So this slide just kind of really walks you through my thought process and all of the conversations I've had, like I mentioned, with residents, the community water supplies, and then all of those different policy conversations that Eagle and with the governor's office about, again, how do we reach water equity? So one of the things I really wanted to highlight, and I'm not going to walk you through all of this because I want to make sure there's space for the other presentations, but I want to talk about transparency around public health impacts. You know, that's key. We need to make sure that we are being really transparent in our regulatory lens and what that covers, and then what folks can do to make sure that they're being safe and being protective of their family's health. You know, I would receive phone calls from folks that had immunocompromised people within their home, children, and wanting to know, okay, what should I do? I'm being told that our water meets this regulatory standard. What can I do? And it was really about, you know, making sure that we were providing information about filtering and other steps they can do with flushing and just in general maintenance of their water system. So it's really about making sure that we have that communication and transparency up front. Another thing that I'm going to touch on a little bit later is equitable funding. Are we providing funding in the most aggressive and convenient way for our most vulnerable populations or communities? Are we making sure that it's accessible? And so I'm going to talk about one of the efforts that we were working on as I was transitioning out of this role. There's also integrated asset management, which is a nod to my new role and really making sure that we're thinking about that strategy, how we have those assets for water infrastructure, road infrastructure, and everything in between, communications, how we're being really intentful about how we're using our resources to make these investments. Policy and legislation is key. We have to have more transparency around data and funding structures, adequate staffing. Like I mentioned before, I had the opportunity to talk to community water supplies and hear from them about some of the shortfalls that they had. You know, some of them had been managed by emergency managers, and so they had diminished staffing capacity, or they had diminished tax base because, again, folks were fleeing some communities and going to another community looking for jobs. So again, how do we make sure that we're able to get those resources into communities so that they can invest in their infrastructure and provide quality water at an affordable rate? True engagement is another thing. I'm glad that we're all here and we're having this conversation. This needs to continue. We need true engagement with community and stakeholder and people that are impacted by the decisions that we make as we think about this overarching water equity strategy. And then again, I mean, water rates that are affordable, that's the key right there too. So those again are just, I feel like it really just gives you an idea of all of the moving pieces. And there's many more that I haven't even, you know, listed here that are involved as we think about this overarching water equity. So next, I want to talk about just what are some of the things that we can do? What are some of the tangible things that we can do as we're thinking about all of the things that feed into water equity? And that's where I really wanted to highlight some of the work that we did with the water leak pilot. You know, really looking at affordability, but more at a micro level. What can we do within community to be impactful? We know that older communities have aging infrastructure both inside and outside the home. We heard stories from residents that had bills that were hundreds and thousands of dollars because of failing premise plumbing. So what can we do to make those investments within community? And that's why I'm really excited about this initiative. And I'll say why I'm excited about it is because all the players we have at the table. This wasn't something that we just, you know, we had two people at the table and we mapped it out. This was a long planning session of having some tough conversations. And I appreciate those tough conversations because I feel like it's gotten us to a place where this can be really impactful. But I'm happy to see Sylvia and Monica on the line and part of this panel because Sylvia was very integral in making sure that this water leak pilot included not only premise plumbing, but also that we touched on the lead and water. So that enhancement aspect of it, of what are we doing to be protective of public health in addition to this resource that we were employing in communities. But essentially with the Water Leak pilot, we're targeting $800 to $1,000 per home in Highland Park and Benton Harbor. We're going to be doing some water leak repairs. We were able to partner with, in addition to the great folks here, but our energy efficient partners and get some energy efficient water heaters, Kohler products, WaterSense products, but really looking at it holistically. How, when we have these connections with community residents, are we being most impactful and making it so that the burden isn't on them to seek additional resources? And within this pilot, we were looking at addressing premise plumbing, energy efficiency measures, and then again, that lead assessment and abatement work that's really critical. Another thing that I'm going to talk about in the infrastructure conversation tomorrow is, again, I talked about funding and making sure that it's getting to our most vulnerable populations. And I'll just touch on that briefly. But really, we partnered with the Michigan Municipal League and Mott Foundation, and we're working to have 2 navigator roles that can support this. So it's a shared solution concept where we have a person that will come in and work with community water suppliers and determine what's your strategy, what are the things that we need to fix short-term and long-term, what are some of the things that you need to invest in, and then we have a grant writer that would help them in terms of procuring those federal and state funds. So again, I think it's all of these little pieces coming together, but making sure that we have that equity lens in place and making sure that we keep that at the forefront. So thanks, Regina. I mean, I can touch on it a little more, but again, I want to give Sylvia and other folks an opportunity, and definitely feel free to circle back and I can talk about a few other conversations that I've had with folks during my time as Clean Water Public Advocate.
Thank you so much for that, Nina. And since you referenced Sylvia in your conversation, we're going to go to her next. And, you know, we've had conversations, Sylvia, about the kind of broad spectrum of what water equity really means and how we have to take varying things into account. Can you expand on that a little bit and just talk about that from your perspective?
Yes, for sure. And thank you, Regina. And thank you, Nina, too, for framing it in the way that you did, too, because you're right that the issue of equity has multiple components. But I think I even want to add additional layers to it and actually pull it back a little bit to how we even got into the whole conversation about water affordability to begin with. And so, you know, this gets back to, 20 plus years ago, also, as you're mentioning there, Highland Park again, is that this work in many regards started in the city of Highland Park, where residents were being disconnected and there was a whole set of problems going on with the water system and being able to still serve the number of residents that live there, but also not having the overall sort of funding capacity to be able to do the upgrades that were necessary, right? A lot of changes over the years as corporations left and other residents left, and you've got a smaller tax base of people who are left to hold the cost of operating a city. And so we saw Highland Park be the first city that experienced emergency management and were forced into decisions by the state, by other sorts of contracted people that were not necessarily in the interest of the residents. And so that matters because we saw that play out time and time again in other emergency manager cities. And so I say this because one of the things that we have to do when we're having the conversation of equity is go back to this whole matter of disproportionately impacted people, right? And so the conversations have to be about not how do we ensure that everyone has water, or how do we ensure that water is affordable for everyone? Many people, this is not an issue that they even have to think about in their homes, right? The bill comes in, you pay it, you don't even blink. We're talking about communities, not just emergency manager cities, but a lot of other marginally economic communities across the state where residents have been struggling with their water bills for decades, right? And so the problem has been largely a local one because our utilities are local, or well, if you're living in a centralized system, right? But even for residents who are in these decentralized systems where you're having to rely upon wells and septic tanks or any other kinds of means just to be able to get water in and wastewater out, we haven't created ways in which we can ensure that we treat water as a human right, for one, in the state of Michigan, and also that we understand the significance of the disparities. So we've also kind of gotten into a pattern with the way that we've treated water and the access and affordability of it is almost as something that's optional, not something that's necessary for life, that we all have to have. It's not something that you get or that you can have if you can pay for it. And what we actually really learned too over the past of this COVID pandemic, and thank goodness for the leadership that we've gotten from the governor and from you, and actually both you and Regina, Nina, is that you really helped us be able to have these conversations in communities that we haven't been able to have before. So as advocates, we've been trying to push this whole concept of equity in the sense that, look, we've got to ensure that the most vulnerable residents among us have access to the basic needs for life, right? And so when we're talking about water specifically, it's got to be accessible, it's got to be affordable, and it's got to be clean. And that also means it shouldn't be discolored, right? And so what does it mean even then? Well, the water system says, well, it's clean when we got it to your house, right? We can't be responsible for what's going on in the pipes of your house that made it discolored, right? But then when we're having the whole conversation too about, well, then what do we need to do to make sure that residents are never in these cycles of shutoffs and paying for fees to get them reconnected? We haven't really looked closely at how it is that the disconnected conversations we've had with our utilities, with our local officials, and how it is that we approach water and wastewater in the state are connected to the very real consequential problems at the household level, right? And so even if we're talking about what it is that we can point to at the EPA, we still don't have household-based affordability rates, right? In the state of Michigan and in Detroit in particular, we've been trying to push for income-based water affordability that'd be no more than 3%. We've gotten years of pushback on that. And I'm glad that Ode is here today too, because he's been really instrumental in doing that background research to say, look, the arguments that have been put forward to say we can't have these affordability-based programs are not based in actual real disputed challenges, right? So the issue between taxes and fees is real. And so I believe that has a whole other deserving space for conversation. But I think what I want to keep uplifting here is that we have to focus on the vulnerably impacted, disproportionately impacted residents of our state when we're having these conversations about equity. Otherwise, we're going to keep sort of going over the problem, right? It feels good. We're going through the processes and asking the kinds of questions that make it so that we feel like we're doing something to address the needs of all residents. But this isn't a problem at this time of all residents. And we have to talk about it in that context, especially when we're talking about impacted environmental justice communities, right? So the issues with water, they overlay energy, they overlay housing, they overlay recycling, all kinds of other issues that are going on, right? In EJ communities, pollution, and access to the resources that we need to address them. But we have to have an honest conversation about how it is we keep allowing certain populations across our state to live without adequate water because they don't have the political power, they don't have the economic resources, and they're not considered priority communities, right? And so as we're looking at how it is that we're going to build sort of the economic base that we need for addressing these issues, particularly in our infrastructure, or ensuring that we're providing the capacity and resources that are needed in our decentralized systems of folks, again, that are on wells and septic tanks, we have to look at, again, first, where do we need to begin? We've continued to let too many communities sort of not be directly addressed and figure we'll get to you at some point, right? But right now we don't have the money and we keep doing that, right? So some folks have called it that kicking the can down the road, but this is actually deeper than that. We are allowing whole communities of people to almost live in a water deprivation caste system in Michigan and other parts of our country, right? And so this is even in addition to all of the conversations we can have around what's going on with lead. And so we have to address this directly, and we have to be honest about where we need to put our priorities so that water equity is also about the outcomes that we need to come forward with. So
Thank you so much for that. Yeah,
I'm looking forward to hearing more from others here.
Yes, absolutely. So Monica, I'm going to go to you. I know that affordability is a huge issue for you, but also making sure people have water while we're figuring it out. So can you speak to the work that you do and how it links to the affordability challenge and water equity?
Well, for us, our work is deeply rooted in, as Sylvia stated, the human right to water. And it really has been an extension of a legacy of work that was rooted here in the city of Detroit, not only with Michigan welfare rights, but with legislative champions like the late, great Marianne Mahaffey and the Honorable Councilwoman Joanne Watson. So we had legislative leadership working in tandem with community that understood that there had to be a pathway to clean, safe, and affordable water. As we came into this work, what we recognized is during the bankruptcy, as was alluded to, emergency management was justifying the shutting off of massive numbers of households from access to water. That caused us to have to mobilize ourselves and respond to our own crisis. But it not only lent itself to what was happening here in Detroit, it also lent itself to what was happening in Flint, because those two crises were happening in tandem. They weren't happening in isolation. And so some of the same communities that had worked for decades for labor rights and human rights and civil rights were the same groups that came together in 2010 and leading into emergency management to organize themselves to fend off what we knew was the austerity of emergency management. And you can't talk about what's happening right now without lending itself not only to what happened with emergency management, but it has deep roots in the racialized narrative that, let everything in Detroit go bankrupt. The last one out cut the lights off. Nothing good left in Flint. Why don't they just move? Those folks in Benton Harbor can't manage themselves. And so all of those racialized narratives have lent themselves to the divide that we see right now. Water inequities don't come from anywhere. Water inequities have come out of, since what, 1977, the US government has divested from water infrastructure. And then what we know is that at the height of the US government's investment in water infrastructure, they were spending about 67 to 69% of the dollars that went into water infrastructure. The government now is spending a dismal 7 to 9% of the dollars that are invested into water infrastructure. And so what happened is, as that divestment happened, then that gaping budgetary hole landed on the backs of individual ratepayers. When you look all up and down I-75, from Detroit to Flint to Toledo to Chicago, what you will find is many of those communities that have been left with the legacy of toxicity. Those were the same communities that were part of the arsenal of democracy. Those were the same communities that put the world on wheels. As many people moved outside of that urban core, that toxicity, that legacy of being a war machine, an auto factory, the industrialized movement that actually built the middle class of this country, those communities were left behind. And when we talk about building back better, we can never talk about building back better without talking about water equity, water accessibility, and water quality. So one of the things that we have been very blessed to do as we've gone across the state of Michigan with many colleagues and comrades is we've also found that for rural partners and rural communities, if we will begin to build beyond this racialized narrative that somehow you're subsidizing Detroit or Flint or some other small rural Black community and begin to talk about how to build great quality and good water and the best water system and best water system management in the country by starting with Michigan as the Great Lakes state, then we'll be on to something. And one of the things that I think community has done extremely well is they have used citizen science. They have used mapping and data to actually showcase and evidence that community is the best place to start with having these conversations of how we're going to move forward and how we're going to build this collective bipartisan idea of water affordability. When you talk to urban centers like Detroit and Flint, we are in a situation where our water is unaffordable because we have the oldest parts of the water infrastructure. And therefore, we have the legacy of the debt of building that infrastructure, and it's not shared among the region. When you talk to somebody in a rural community like Oscoda, Michigan, they are bearing down the burden of processing PFAS out of their drinking water system. Well, for that community, what they are needing is they're needing more assistance around the technology and how to be able to invest and garner those state revolving fund dollars so that they can really invest in shoring up their small communities to compete for grants and other funds. But a lot of times it's the technology that is missing for them. So that makes it an affordability issue. When you talk about a community, maybe a suburban community, maybe Ypsilanti per se, for them, it's technology and a need to build the capacity to be able to compete for those dollars, but it's also being able to invest in the management systems for their water infrastructure. So we're not void of the idea that utilities are needing to be invested in as well. But where we tend to find ourselves at odds is many times the utilities have taken on these racist narratives, and they're repeating bad information, bad practice, and bad ideology, and then they can't figure out why we can't all come to the table and get along. Well, first, we've got to start with some truth telling. I think part of this conference talked about the mistrust that we were hoping to be able to debunk and dismantle. Well, part of mistrust starts with just not telling the truth. Well, we've got to tell the truth that no, Detroit didn't create a water crisis for the region. And no, you're not subsidizing Detroit. As a matter of fact, Detroit is subsidizing 10% of the overall budget for the city of Detroit goes to subsidize the Great Lakes Water Authority. That's a part of telling the truth. No, it's not in the best interest of Detroit to be in this inequitable agreement with the Great Lakes Water Authority. And it plays well to a racist narrative that somehow you're rescuing Detroit when that's not the truth. So if we could tell the truth that somehow there's a lot of inequity baked into the Great Lakes Regional Agreement, it could be better negotiated. Is there a need for greater transparency, greater management, all of that? Yes, but when you have a system that was built on the backs of Black and brown and poor and working class residents that's providing water to 40% of the population of the state of Michigan, and then you've got some folks wanting to have a national conversation about investing in water infrastructure in Michigan, but they don't want to have a conversation about water equity and water justice for Black folks in Michigan, you're going to have a problem in Michigan. So Regina, I'll stop there because you know this sort of gets my blood boiling and gets me up in the morning. This is what gets me excited.
I felt the flow coming on. I felt the flow coming on. And I want to make sure, and we'll continue the conversation, but I want to make sure that we get a chance to hear from Ode, who's done a lot of research. And one of the things I'll put in context for folks who aren't based in Michigan is that our water systems and supplies are not regulated by the state. Quality is regulated, but each community has its own supply. And so we have over 1,000 different water sources that people could potentially get their water from in the state of Michigan. And so that adds an extra layer of complication and complexity that may not exist. In fact, I know it doesn't exist in some parts of the country. So Ode, I'll use that as a segue for you to talk about what you've seen. I know you've worked with community and done research to really figure out if there were an affordability plan, what would it look like for the state?
Thank you, Regina. There's that old saying, when you're at a panel discussion, never ever follow Sylvia Orduño and Monica Lewis Patrick. But I'm gonna.
I've heard that.
I'm gonna do my best. Yeah, thank you, Regina. You mentioned that I've done this research. You mentioned that I'm the attorney for the National Wildlife Federation. I also direct the University of Michigan Law School's Environmental Law and Sustainability Clinic. My clinic students and the National Wildlife Federation worked on this report in collaboration with the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center, investigating this notion that affordable rates are either illegal in Michigan, or even if they're legal, they're still going to be considered a tax under Michigan's Headley Amendment and have to go through extra process. We worked very closely with Sylvia and others on this report, and the conclusions we reached are that no, it is not unlawful, definitely not unlawful, and it definitely is not a tax under the Headley Amendment. And not surprisingly, when we hear various people make these claims, they're never supported by analysis. So we wanted to produce our own analysis to make sure that that it was out there for the public to consume. But you mentioned, Regina, something that I want to pick up on, which is because we have this very local atomized system of many, many, many water systems, some municipal, some regional, some privatized, some public, how do you, should we centralize, and is there a better way to do this? I think that what we need right now, because there are so many people suffering, and although there are a lot of programs that folks are working on and advocating for that will help, they're all helping, I think, around the margins or helping in small ways, and it's going to take a long time. I think one thing that we really need right now is state legislation that steps in and harmonizes across water systems. And that does a few things. One, we have different water rate standards for different kinds of municipalities in Michigan, villages and cities and boroughs and townships. There are different water rate standards for all of them. Those need to be harmonized, number one. Number two, although our analysis is very clear that there's nothing legally preventing municipalities or water systems generally from having income-based rates, nothing at all, that it's a matter of political will. And so what we really need is we need the state to require that water systems offer an affordable rate alongside the traditional rate, an affordable rate that applies to a percentage of the population to support them, to make sure that that community is also contributing and is able to be healthy, to be in school, to be at work, and you need to be able to afford clean water, clean, safe water in order to do those things. So I think what we need the state to do is to harmonize water rates, to require that water systems develop affordable rates. Now, maybe every single water system needs to develop an income rate. Maybe there's a little bit of leeway, and different water systems can have different affordable rates. But the key thing is that you have to have the state step in here and actually require that, I think, of water systems. Now, that doesn't mean that the water warriors, Sylvia, Monica, and many, many others who have been at this for a long time need to stop their advocacy when it comes to municipal systems. They should absolutely not stop. Obviously, they're doing an amazing job, and they're trying to overcome very, very significant obstacles. But I think that if state legislation were to come into to place, that could really help. I think there are all kinds of issues about renters versus owners, and who is in control of their water bill account, and how do you make sure that affordability is passed not only to people who own their homes, but people who may rent apartments or rent homes when the water bill account may be in the landlord owner's name. So there are all these component parts. And I'll say one more thing, which is, and again, I think state legislation would help create some minimum standards here. By the way, just in case anybody thinks, oh, this is a bad idea and we've never done anything like this before, this is how environmental law works today. Today, the federal government sets minimum standards, harmonized minimum standards that apply in a uniform way across the board, and then they allow states to actually implement those standards. I'm only talking about that model for water and wastewater within the states, where the state sets those minimum uniform harmonized standards and the local water systems implement them. I think that public participation and transparency is really bad out there. Monica, Sylvia, and others have really gotten the message out, and they've done a great job of increasing public participation. But the fact is that a lot of local systems are just not structured in ways that promote public participation and transparency. So it is to no one's surprise that when you get a regional water system or a privatized water system, people complain because they weren't part of the process to begin with, to design what that system would look like. Even if you're gonna, some people would say regionalization and privatization, this is never a good idea, but let's say regionalization. Even if you're gonna go with regionalization, in some instances, the public is not invited to talk about it, to design it, and to vote on it. So I think the other thing that you need from state intervention here is you need to have some minimum standards when it comes to public participation and transparency. And obviously it goes without saying that you can't just push standards onto water systems to meet without also providing them the funding that they need through the state budgetary process, through revolving fund mechanisms and others. Those two things have to go hand in hand. So I think my ultimate conclusion is, although municipalities are working very hard and water systems are working hard and water warriors like Sylvia, Monica, and others are also working hard at the local level, I think it's time for some state intervention.
Thank you so much for that, O'Day. I will say, a lot of people are asking in the questions about the study that you referenced. Is that study available?
Yes, I can post the link in the chat.
Okay, great. So piggybacking on that, I think we kind of went full circle from talking about some of the things that are happening now, some of the things that we want, that advocates are calling for and have long been calling for. And I know from the administration standpoint, there is the goal of figuring out a long-term strategy, so it's not short-term. And to the point that you made, O'Day, about what it would take to totally change the laws, are there thoughts in terms of interim steps that would help move the process along? So I'll throw that out and see if there are folks who wanna answer that on the panel.
So I think the complexity that was noted around just the sheer number of water systems we have, water utilities that we have, is a large part of the problem, right? And so it's not something as if you can just say, all right, here's what we're going to do for water affordability across the state, right? There are a lot of variety in terms of system sizes and how they operate and the ways that folks are accessing their water and wastewater. And so one of the things that we have to sort of agree to in Michigan is that we have to ensure that all vulnerable people will have the water that they need, right? That's a beginning place right there. And so even if we go back and just say, all right, in the moment of a crisis, when we saw this happening in Michigan, how did we respond and what are we doing differently? And, I don't know how many different sort of spaces I'm in where folks keep talking about Flint, right? Oh, well, we never want to see another Flint. We've seen other Flints in Michigan. We've seen other Flints across the country, right? And we keep not making sure that we really understand the relationship between the utility with low-income customers, the ability to pay for those bills at the household level, and the ability to afford the cost of the infrastructure at the local level, right? And again, that's just for centralized systems. And so we have not also said, all right, in the case where we know that a utility is struggling or a whole community is struggling being able to pay their water bills, what can we do to ensure that they will have the water that they need for life, right? And it's not even just flip to say that, right? It's everything from the first thing you do in the morning, right? To go into flushing that toilet, brushing your teeth, taking your medication, whatever you've got to do, right? And so we, again, aren't appreciating how much we need water for life, which gets us back to this whole conversation around the human right to it, right? And people say, well, you can't have a right if you can't pay for it. No, we can. These are about the priorities and the ways in which we establish what we want as Michiganders, right? What we are willing to fight for and what we are willing to demand so that everyone has it, right? And so we've got to get out of this sort of narrow framing of saying, you can't have water if you can't afford it. We can't afford to not ensure everyone has water, right? Because there are enormous consequences. And we spent the last year and a half pointing out the importance of making sure all residents who had been disconnected or didn't have water in their decentralized system had some way of getting it, right? There was going to be a reconnection, there was going to be help with your plumbing, there were going to be assistance with making sure bottled water was delivered. And thank God for folks like We the People, right? They really were out there trying to figure out how they could get to people who didn't have water. Well, all these things are being worked out. We have to ensure that we're prioritizing water and wastewater in ways it means we're going to have to get into the neighborhood level and deal with people until we can deal with the larger systemic issues, right? And that's really where we're at, is we've got too many people living with insecure access to water, with water that is regularly disconnected. And I can't tell you right now how many people are freaked out about what's going to happen now that the moratorium expired at the end of March, right? And we know that a lot of our local water utilities are holding off in anticipation that the ARPA money is coming through. But some of them right now are saying, we can't wait any longer. We have to start collecting, right? We can't keep absorbing any more debt. And these are real concerns, but the concerns are also very real for when we have residents who can't afford to access water and have to need it and have to be able to have it available to them. So what we can do though at the state level is say, all right, if we look at all of the utilities across the state, what can we begin to do that we need to know better? We don't know anything about how it is we all operate within our different rate structures, what our asset management plans are, how many customers are on centralized or decentralized systems, how many customers are living with insecurity, water insecurity that we might have to address in potable waterways, right? And we have to be willing to have that conversation and depoliticize it, at least in the sense of ensuring that, again, the larger goal of ensuring Michiganders have water security is met. And we haven't gotten to that point now where we can do it without, again, the blaming, the racialization, as Monica was talking about, and actually the distractions from actually what should be our central point of this conversation.
Thank you so much for that, Sylvia. We've got a few minutes left, so I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to make a last statement. We're going to try to keep them short so we get everyone in. This dialogue will continue, like Nina said, but as part of this session and our focus on water equity, if you have a last statement about what we need, what is the very next step you'd like to see happen in this process. And I am going to go, since you were last, O'Day, I'm gonna let you go first in this part.
Thank you, Regina. In terms of, some immediate next steps, what I hope will happen, it already is happening to some extent. We have some of the best colleges and universities in the world right here in Michigan. And one thing that I think a lot of water systems are lacking is the ability to generate useful data about their systems, about their users, about billing practices, about what needs to change moving forward. And one of my hopes is that more colleges and universities, will work with water systems to help give them that support, and that ultimately our revolving fund, dollars can, after other priorities are taken care of, can go toward helping these water systems keep and generate and manage data and be able to analyze it to better understand, where the vulnerabilities are, where the efficiencies can be gained.
All right, thank you for that, O'Day. I'm going to go to Monica next.
Building off of what O'Day just said, I definitely would like to see more investment in the technologies and sort of shoring up the ability for smaller systems and even mid to larger systems to be able to manage their ability to compete for more dollars, to be able to go after those state revolving fund dollars. But what I would say to all of us is that we could never, ever have these convenings of discussions around equity and justice without understanding that those most impacted must stay at the center of the conversation. We have found out over and over again, regardless of what community you go in, be it Oscoda with PFAS or Flint with lead or Detroit with massive water shutoffs, these communities have now not only become the poster child for these inequities and injustices, but they also have become the experts nationally and globally for where the solutions are. And so I would just encourage all of us to really continue to center those voices, follow that leadership, and deputize ourselves to all be a part of being solutionaries for how Michigan's going to move forward for greater water justice and greater water equity.
Thank you so much for that, Monica. Nina.
Thanks. I think we skipped Sylvia. But I don't. So I definitely want to build on that. And I was taking some notes as you all were speaking. And I love this conversation for so many reasons, because it touches on all the things that we need to incorporate in our work on a day-to-day basis. We have to have those conversations about, again, the equity gap that was created due to systemic inequities. We have to be upfront with that. And I think that's where we lead. We have to be upfront with what has happened historically. And then there has to be policy changes so that we have more information about rate structures. That should be baked into our grant and loan requirements so that we have that data to make informed decisions. And then also just thinking of equity, our same communities that, again, have the higher rates are the same communities that typically have water quality issues. And that's frustrating within itself. So what do we need to do? We have to acknowledge that things have been taken from this community. So we're not subsidizing it. You know, we have to make our communities whole. And that's what I'm saying. We have to have a targeted approach of making sure that we have a shared solution that goes out and says, how can we help these gaps that we created? How can we address these concerns? How can we help find funding to address these gaps? How can we, again, make sure that we're being impactful? So I really think it takes all of this laying of the groundwork, but first with acknowledgement of why this gap exists as a starting point.
I don't know, Sylvia, if you had any last comment, or are you done? Are you good?
I gave plenty of comments, so thank you. I'm going to share the space.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being part of this. I can't believe how quickly this went. This was a great conversation, and I think it is helpful for us. You know, this is the first convening of this conference where we're talking about so many different issues, but water connects to almost everything we do in this state, and the affordability challenge is real, and your help in helping the state solve that is critical. What the administration can do, what needs to happen by legislation. So thank you so much for being part of this. I know there are questions in the chat and in Hoover that we didn't get to. So I will encourage the panelists, you have access to go into Hoover, see what questions are out there for you. I think Les, who's part of our team, shared some of the links we shared in the chat here with Hoover. It's cool kind of having two platforms, but it definitely makes for a little work and keeping people up to date. But we will also look to provide additional information in response to some of the questions that are here. So thank you all. I want to thank the panelists. You are all people I talk to often, so please continue to share with me as much as you can. I don't have to ask. I know that you will. Thank you so much for being part of the session. Our next session starts at 5:15. It's an evening EJ Town Hall, focused on rebuilding trust, reimagining justice, and removing barriers, our theme. Hopefully you'll join us then. Everybody have a great afternoon. Thank you so much.